Okay, go ahead.
Okay, so just give it like 10 seconds. Okay, live.
Okay, welcome everybody on behalf of Los Angeles Museum of the Holocaust. I'm pleased to welcome you to this virtual Holocaust survivor talk. My name is Michael Morgenstern and I'm an educator at the museum, and this afternoon you have the honor and privilege of listening to Dr. Raul Artal-Mittelmark, a Holocaust survivor who will share his story with you. For those of you who have not been to the museum before, ours is the first Holocaust survivor founded Holocaust museum in the United States. In the 1960s, a group of survivors worked together to create a memorial for their loved ones who perished in the Holocaust, and this memorial eventually became our museum. You can see in my virtual background our museum to what our museum looks like today. And these survivors who established our museum did so with the mission to commemorate, educate, and inspire future generations. Even though we are not able to be in our museums a physical space for the time being, we're still able to carry on this mission of theirs. And today, Dr. Raul Artal-Mittelmark will share his story with you. And for those of you listening in Zoom and on Facebook, you can type in questions and he will answer them afterwards. So thank you so much, Raul, and you may start.
Thank you very much, Michael, and welcome. And I hope that during these challenging times, you are all safe and healthy. I'm most honored to share with you my life journey during the most challenging times. The Holocaust was certainly a most challenging time for my people, the Jewish people, that were threatened with extinction. I was born in a Nazi slave labor and extermination camp, Bershad, Transnistria, which is currently located in Western Ukraine. Very few people have ever heard of Transnistria, and certainly not of Bershad, since suppression of the suffering of the Jewish people during World War II on USSR territory was suppressed by the communist authorities for many years. Transnistria was an artificially created region in Western Ukraine between the rivers Bug and Dniester. How did I get there, and how did my parents get there, and under which circumstances was I born there? And I was literally born in a cowshed that housed deportees, basically a barn, a half-destroyed barn. Why were my people sent there, my parents? And it's important to point out that during World War II, about a million and a half Jewish children under Nazi occupation were massacred. Only about 5% of them survived, and I'm among the lucky one that survived. As a background, we all know as to why my people had to go through these horrendous times, because anti-Semitism was rampant in Europe and everywhere else, particularly in Nazi Germany and their followers. In 1941, at the infamous Wannsee Conference, Himmler, the SS leader, decided extermination through work. All Jews should be exterminated, and those that cannot work, just eliminate. A reason given was that basically Jews were subhumans, genetically inferior, and being Jewish was an incurable disease. Ironically, in more recent years, large mother-fetal risk for genetic disorders indicate that genetic disorders, inherited genetic disorders, are more common among Northern Europeans, that includes the Germans, than among Ashkenazi Jews that lived in Europe. The Germans, the Nazi Germans and their allies had difficulties identifying who was Jewish in Europe. So one fact that is not well known is that IBM came to the help of the Nazi Germany regime, and they invented at that time the punch hole computer system to identify in the general population as to who was Jewish and who was not. Jews had to be exterminated, had to be killed. Numerous extermination camps were set up all over Europe. My family originates from two areas in Eastern Europe, one called Bessarabia and Bukovina. My grandparents on my mother's side, my grandmother had 9 children. My mother was the youngest of 9. My grandfather was the mayor of a city called Khotin, and also he was a pharmacist. He had the opportunity to immigrate to the States in the early 30s, late 30s, however, refused to immigrate to the United States because he wanted, when he would die, to have a big funeral. The sad irony is that not only he had no funeral, but on one of the death marches to a slave labor camp, he could not walk any longer. His body was thrown on the side of the road. My mother was just about to, she just finished actually her training at the music academy in Czernowitz. Czernowitz was the capital of Bukovina, known as the Little Vienna. And the words of the poet Paul Celan, it was considered a city where people and books lived. My mother finished her music training. She was trained as a concert pianist, and she gave her inauguration concert, her graduation concert in 1940, in the June of 1940, about a year before the beginning of World War II. My father came from a family in Bukovina, from a small town near Czernowitz called Storoženec, where they owned a construction, forestry, and cement business, and they were specialized in building bridges. My father and his father, the grandfather, and my father's brother were all trained as civil engineers with expertise in bridge building. After the war erupted in 1941, over 100,000 Jews from that area were sent to slave labor camps, including my parents, were sent to Bershad, to a location called Transnistria, which is in Western Ukraine today. And they were on death marches with other future slaves, Jewish slaves, for close to 200 miles. And a couple of months ago, I attended the anniversary of the liberation of the Auschwitz camp in Auschwitz, Poland. And I came across a poster which I would like to share with you, to share the text. And the text on that poster was the following, a written testimony by Leon Greenman. We were bullied out of the train and stood waiting. A truck arrived, stopped near us, and on the truck were all the women and children. In the center, my wife was standing up with our baby. A picture I will never forget. All of them were supposed to have gone to undress and then to the gas chambers. 2 hours later, these people were ashes, including my wife and child. I could not help but think about what would have happened if the same occurrence would have included my wife, my spouse, my 3 children, my 8 grandchildren. The only things that were left of the million of Jews that were massacred and gassed and burned in the ovens of Auschwitz and elsewhere are just eyeglasses, carpets made out of women's hair, and suddenly nothing else than just ashes. My grandparents and my parents were sent out from Chernobyl to Transnistria. During these marches, more than half of the victims died of either exposure, hunger, thirst, and savage brutality of the Einsatzgruppen D and the Romanian Iron Guard. The area of Transnistria was given to Romania, to the fascist Romanian, in exchange for them joining Nazi Germany in their war against USSR, and as a location for the extermination of the Jews that were still in existence in Romania and elsewhere on that part of Europe. It was estimated that 1.2 to 1.5 million or more Jews from Bukovina, Bessarabia, Romania, and Western Ukraine perished during World War II. You may just wonder what kind of orders were given to the soldiers which accepted their cruel behavior and mass killing of Jews. And the words of General Walter von Reichenau, the commander of the 6th Army that occupied that part of Europe, he said that there is a necessity of cruel and just revenge against the subhuman Jewry. Just kill them all. The same unit was responsible for the killing of 33,000 Jews at Babi Yar, and at the place where my parents were deported and where I was born, out of the 25 people that got there, 25,000 people, only less than 5,000 survived, and I among them. On the death marches, horrific things happened. Women were raped, paraded naked through the villages and small towns, and in many Ukrainian towns, after they were paraded naked through the city streets, they were thrown alive into limestone burning stoves. It's even difficult to think about it, but that's what they did to thousands of women, a fact that is not commonly recognized. The people on the death marches were instructed to dig mass trenches at about every 15 to 20 miles, and all the dead bodies were thrown there. Father Dubois, who some of you may know the name, has created this organization, Yachad Unum, trying to uncover as to how many people died in all these places and mass graves that are not known to this day. My parents got to Bersha, Transnistria, a Nazi slave labor camp. The slaves worked on digging trenches for the advancing German army, and also working on the close by freeway called Durchstrasse D, which in German means freeway D, one of the first freeways in the world that was supposed to link Germany to the rich Russian Ural mountains, and whoever could not work got executed. They were not fed. Only on the days that they work on the trenches or on the freeways did they get a small piece of bread and a cup of soup. In Bershat, where I was born, this was a very difficult delivery. I came with my feet first. It was a bridge delivery. This usually is considered a very difficult delivery. And luckily enough, there were 5 physicians in the camp, and one of them, by the name of Dr. Menchel, knew how to manage such a delivery. But that later on inspired me to become an obstetrician specializing in high-risk obstetrics. As I mentioned before, it was estimated that about 5,000 people survived the Bershat camp. However, the claim conference has the names of only 1,900 people. Bershat historically was known as a small Jewish town, actually known for its famous weavers of talitot, of prayer shawls, and exporting them of all of Europe. However, during World War II, it became as a killing field, a slave killing field. And the area there were, the camp at one point in time became also the command center for the Einsatzen Group D, the Death Squad D, under the command of Otto Ohlendorf. Otto Ohlendorf, a highly educated individual with 2 doctor's degrees, actually he used to insist to be called doctor. He was the main defendant at the Nuremberg, at the criminal Nuremberg trial of the Nazi criminals. He was found personally responsible for the massacre of 90,000 Jews. Otto Ohlendorf, the doctor murderer. In the area, there were Jewish partisans. You probably may have seen some of the Ukrainian movies with Jewish partisans. And people in the camp used to cooperate with the Jewish partisans and send them information through 2 teenagers that were sneaking out of the camp, telling them information, giving them information about the movement of the Death Squad and the SS troops, and also the Romanian troops that were guarding the camp. They somehow, the Death Squad found out that 2 teenagers were communicating with the partisans, and they tortured them and were able to to put together a list of the people in the camp that were collaborating with the partisans. Among them, my father. They were all taken out the so-called collaborators were taken out to the local cemetery, and they started executing them. My father was taken out also for execution, but he had the intuition when he got to the place where the execution took place, that was the local cemetery. There were a lot of dead bodies laying on the ground. He fell to the ground, pretended to be dead, and the the death squad did not notice what he did, and that's how he survived. He had another horrible experience. The commander of the guards in the camp, the guards were Romanian, and some SS Gestapo also. The commander was Romanian by the name, Nazi Romanian by the name of Gynecology. And on his spare time, he used to entertain himself by tying people, whoever he could catch, behind his motorcycle and drag them behind the motorcycle. It happened to my father also on one occasion, but since he was in pretty good physical shape, he was able to survive the ordeal. The commander, General, was at the end of the war, at the criminal of war trials, he was condemned for life in prison. After 7 years in a prison in Romania, he disappeared, and to this day, they don't know where he disappeared. At the liberation of the camp by the Russian Red Army, the soldiers were under strict orders not to allow families with children on the trucks, not to allow any of the people to come on their trucks. However, my mother, who was fluent in Russian, she also studied Russian literature at the college there in Czernowitz, was able to convince soldiers on a truck to allow my father I to come on a truck. And I will conclude with a kind of a funny story. While on the truck, one of the soldiers pulled out a piece of chocolate and gave me the piece of chocolate. Since I never had solid food before, I did spit the chocolate. And the soldiers burst in laughter, and one of them said to my mother, "Don't worry, he will grow up and become a big commander in the Red Army." My mother, who was trained as a concert pianist, she never missed a beat. She replied, "No, my son will become a doctor." I heard that story so many times, I had no choice but to become a doctor and specializing in high-risk obstetrics. When we got back to Czernowitz, there was no welcome back. My parents and the other refugees were not allowed in their original homes. And while the Nazi German accused the Jews of being communist, now when they came back from the concentration camp, the communists accused them of being capitalist and sent many of them to Siberia. None of them ever returned. My parents ran into Romania, and I will conclude my my life story right now, although there are many more details to share with you. Hope we'll have the opportunity to discuss this again in the future. Thank you for listening, and I will be happy to answer whatever questions you may have.
Thank you so much for sharing your story with us. We do have a few questions from members of the audience. The first question is, would it have been possible for your parents to have fled east when the Germans invaded? Any further east?
No, actually, at that time, Chernovitz and Bukovina was under the communist regime, the USSR, and they were exiling the Jews to Siberia. So when that started, my parents went into hiding. And then when the Nazis came, all the Jews were exposed wherever they were, and vast majority of the people from Chernovitz, where my parents were sent to Transnistria. There is an interesting detail. When they started exiling people from Chernovitz, the mayor of Chernovitz suddenly realized that all the plumbers, without exception, and all the electricians in town were Jewish. So then they convinced the Nazis to allow these people, these Jews, to remain in town, because otherwise they thought the city would collapse, will have no electricity and no functioning plumbing.
Thank you very much. Another question that we have is, have you seen the film Defiance? And if so, how accurate is it?
Yes, I have seen the movie Defiance, and it's very accurate. Of course, there are little details that may not be as accurate as, but the movie per se is factual.
Thank you.
And one thing that I would like to emphasize, that very little is known about what happened to the Jews in that part of the world, because the communist USSR suppressed the information and whatever, and all the Jews were considered Soviet citizens and not Jewish Soviet citizens.
Thank you. As a baby, how was it possible to be hidden in the camp? Do you know any details about the way that in which you were hidden?
Oh, absolutely. I think you will be surprised that at Auschwitz, there were 3,000 deliveries, and about 500 of them that were babies of Polish non-Jewish mothers were given up for adoption, but about 20, 30 or so were hidden in the structures, many times between the legs of their mothers. And a reason being, and the same reason was for Bershad and other camps where babies were born and hidden, was the guards were afraid to go into the structures because of contagious diseases such as typhus and typhoid and all kind of other diseases. During my entire time there after the delivery, I was hidden with a small pillow over my head, and my mother used to always tell the story that I was never a crybaby. But from my camp alone, I know that there have been about 20 or more babies that survived. Actually, a close friend of mine that lives now in Florida also survived. She was born a month apart from me. And there are more details about the camp in a book by Ruth Glassberg called Ruth Journey. She was there as a child in Bershad and also hidden in one of the rooms. Unfortunately, she later during the war, she was an orphan and suffered tremendously.
Thank you. And is there any moment or memory that you have in your life that helped to restore your belief in humanity and in its kindness?
Well, I think in terms of recollections, I have two recollections. One of being on that truck with the Red Army soldiers. And I know when the truck got to the first train station, my parents were asked to leave the truck and to get back to the city from where they were deported to Chernobyl. They went on the roofs of freight trains and on the roof of a wagon. So I had this nightmare for many years of falling off of the roof of that wagon. And the second question was about, Michael?
How any memories that you have that helped restore your belief in humanity and kindness?
Absolutely. Especially my mother, she always used to talk to me about how important is to protect human life, sanctity of life above all. And she always emphasized to me that should I become a physician, and she had no doubt that I will become a physician, my obligation should always be to focus on protecting human life. And I have done that for many years. I practiced as a physician, taking care of the sickest patients for many, many years, and protected human life in more than one way.
Thank you very much for that answer. And as sort of a follow-up to that, somebody in our audience would like to know, where did your parents end up living, and what were their lives like after the Holocaust?
Well, when we got to Romania, because of my father's qualification as a civil engineer with expertise in bridge building and forestry, he was hired there by authorities. And my mother initially was hired as a piano teacher at the music academy. But then in all the communist countries, there was an obligation to teach Russian. So my mother became a Russian language and Russian literature teacher, and attempted for many years to immigrate to the States. It was not until 1960 that we were allowed to immigrate to the States. A few months later, in the June of 1960, my parents and I were walking on the streets somewhere in New York off Madison Avenue. And on the door of a small restaurant, there was a wooden plaque, and on the plaque was inscribed, was written, "No dogs, no Negroes, no Jews." When my parents saw that, they said, "We are out of here." So we moved to Israel. I had yet to finish my high school. I finished my high school in Israel, served in the military where I met my future spouse, Michal. We got married, and after finishing medical school, practiced in Israel, but then came for advanced training in the States. And after multiple opportunities that came my way, we settled here. We have 3 children and 8 grandchildren. And I think 2 of our children also became physicians. They are on our footsteps. My wife is a physician too. She was a psychiatrist. And we have 8 grandchildren.
Well, that's always such a nice thing to hear, especially after you've shared your story of survival, to hear how many children and grandchildren you have. So thank you. We have a few more questions. How would you address anybody right now who is currently struggling for, or who is currently suffering prejudice or any sort of bigotry in their own lives?
I believe that by sharing their life experience with friends and at fora, just like you are promoting, is the best way. However, what's most important is to try and share your life journey and challenges with children in high schools. It's mostly important for those that are right now threatened again with discrimination. And sadly enough, we know that anti-Semitism is spreading again. Racial hatred is spreading again. Intolerance is spreading. I think these are challenging times for everybody. And I hope that we learn from these challenging times as to what's most important in life is the sanctity of human life and values, civic and cultural and ethnic values that have to be preserved and respected.
Thank you very much for that answer. How many languages do you speak and which ones?
Well, you probably wonder about my accent. Over the years, I learned when I started giving talks that accents form at the age of 11. So whatever you live at the age of 11, that's your accent for life. And actors like here in Los Angeles at Hollywood, they are actors that come from foreign countries, have available voice training and where they can change their accents. I attempted that, but then after a while, I was told, why would you do that? So I preserved my original accent. My first language was German, second was Russian, third was Romanian. So my accent is a mixture of German, Romanian and German accent. The fourth language was English, fifth language was Hebrew, and sixth language, because we studied college in Italy, I also speak Italian. So you have a choice of 6 languages.
Can't believe it's only 6. Thank you very much. When did you start sharing your story with the public?
Well, I would like to share with you a quote from Elie Wiesel, who I had the privilege to know. And he encouraged me whenever we met to testify and to share my life journey. And the quote from him was that, for the survivor who chooses to testify, it is clear his duty is to bear witness for the dead and for the living. He has no right to deprive future generations of a past that belongs to our collective memory. To forget would be not only dangerous, but offensive. To forget the dead would be akin to killing them a second time. And I'm sorry I couldn't share with you my images, but he sent that to me with personal dedication to my friend Raul. I was predominantly involved in medical education and frequently lectured also about the role of physicians and nurses during the Holocaust. It was after my retirement about 5-6 years ago that I decided to engage also in Holocaust education at schools, at both at the Holocaust Museum and at the Simon Wiesenthal Museum. I feel that's an obligation.
And I know that you are active with March of the Living. Can you please explain March of the Living for those who don't know of it, and just talk about your experiences there and how that has been for you?
March of the Living is actually a symbol and expression to the new generation of Jewish people to go to the places where Jews were massacred in Europe and to express our desire for a future that belongs to people that do not engage in hate, discrimination, and murder. Usually it's the March of the Living is a gathering of predominantly, I would say the vast majority of Jewish teenagers that will travel to Poland and stop at different locations in Poland where Jewish culture has once flourished, and it ends up at Auschwitz, and there are ceremonies there. There are also there are smaller delegation of adults that join the close to 10,000, if not more, teenagers from all over the world. The March of the Living is also joined by educators and by survivors who share stories, history, and information with predominantly with the teenagers, and the adults get information from other people that join the march. So it's 1 week in Poland and 1 week in Israel, and the march ends at the Independence Day, the Yom Ha'atzmaut in Jerusalem. And it's a very moving experience for those that have never attended. I highly recommend that you try to attend either as a teenager or as an adult. It's a unique experience. Unfortunately, this year it had to be canceled because of the pandemic, but hopefully next year it would be possible to renew these events.
Thank you very much. And it's like our last question. We have a question from a high school teacher who would like to know what you think the best way is to address to students the legitimacy of the Holocaust, when unfortunately there are so many videos that people can find online that all sorts of people promote Holocaust denial. What do you think the best way is to teach younger people about the Holocaust and to make sure that they don't get confused with any of these weird things available?
Well, I think it's very important to share the history of the Jewish people. Anti-Semitism has played a crucial role over centuries, and it's important for young people to understand the origin of hate. Hate should not be part of a civilized society, but unfortunately there is a resurgence of anti-Semitism all over the world, and most troubling among young people on college campuses, where it's absolutely rampant. So I usually do not like to use the word education. I think I rather use the expression of sharing facts, sharing history, and allowing the young adults and children in schools as early as junior high or younger to understand that hate has no place in our modern society. But unfortunately, it still happens at different levels, as sadly we are witnessing right now this week, and that's very sad. But sharing information is all you can do, is just like sharing any other events of human history and what we can learn from human history. The lessons of history are very important, and they should never repeat themselves. History should not repeat itself. Unfortunately, it does.
Thank you so much again for sharing your story with us and for answering questions. And thank you to our audience for listening and asking questions. I'd like to just say that we had a lot of comments just that weren't questions, but people were just thanking you so much for sharing your story, and people really appreciated this opportunity and being able to listen to you. May
I reply?
Of course.
I must say I was most honored to share with you my life journey, particularly during this most challenging time, and that allows us to reflect on the sanctity of life.
Well, thank you so much. If Gabriella Karen is listening, she's another survivor in our community who I would like to thank her because she actually introduced Raul Artal to us. The two of them met on March of the Living. And Raul was actually also friends with Bob Jaminder, a survivor who unfortunately passed away, who served on the museum's board of directors for many years. So again, thank you to both of them. I would like to remind everybody that while the museum is closed, we will be providing programs regularly like this one, virtual programs. Of course, when it's safe and the museum's open, whenever that will be, I invite everybody who hasn't been to come and see it and come for programs then. But in the meantime, we have many virtual programs like this. Tomorrow, Thursday, June 4th at 11 o'clock, we have a program, Courage and Conscience, the story of Polish Catholic rescuers Stefania and Helen Podgorska from the small city of Przemysl in Poland. They rescued 13 Jews and hid them in their attic for almost 2 years, and their children will be speaking about this. And Tuesday, June 9th, we have Holocaust survivor Jerry Weiser. He will be sharing his story. To learn more about our events and to stay posted, you can look at our website, www.lamobs.org. And of course, if you're already on our Facebook page, you will get our notifications there. Thank you so much for your attention. And thank you so much again, Raul, for sharing your story with us today.
Thank you.